The middle class isn't disappearing. That's the paradox. You've heard for years that it's being hollowed out, crushed, erased. Politicians repeat it, headlines reinforce it, but here's the contradiction buried in the data. The middle class is shrinking because millions of people are moving up, not falling down. And if that's true, it changes how you should interpret almost every economic argument aimed at you. This matters to you because your paycheck, your housing costs, and your future are constantly being explained through this story of decline, a story that says the system failed you. But a recent study by economists Stephen Rose and Scott Winship reframes the entire debate. Instead of defining the middle class by a moving median, they use fixed purchasing power, same buying ability, same real standard of living. When incomes rise, that method shows something uncomfortable for the decline narrative. Since 1979, the share of Americans in the upper middle class didn't inch up. It roughly tripled, from about 10% to 31%. At the same time, the share considered lower middle class or poor fell substantially. That's not collapse, that's upward motion. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. If people are moving up, why does it feel like something is breaking? Because the tension isn't where you've been told to look. And once you see where it actually is, the story flips. Here's how the issue usually gets framed. You're told the middle class is shrinking, and the implication is obvious. People are sliding backward. That the floor is giving out. That the American promise is failing in real time. But notice how vague that claim is. Shrinking how exactly? Fewer people in the middle, less wealth, less buying power. Most narratives never slow down to answer that. Rose and Winship do, and the way they do it quietly breaks the standard story. Most studies define the middle class relative to the national median. That sounds neutral, but it isn't. As the country gets richer, the dividing line automatically rises. Even if everyone is better off in real terms, the middle still looks smaller. Under that system, progress can look like loss. So they change the lens. Fixed purchasing power, inflation-adjusted income, what people can actually buy. Under that approach, the core middle class does shrink modestly, but not because people are falling, because they're moving beyond it. This reframes the entire debate. If upward mobility is driving the change, then policies built on a story of mass decline may be solving the wrong problem. So here's the real question. If the data points up, why does the political and emotional narrative point down? Because the numbers aren't where the pressure is coming from. And that's where this gets more complicated. Here's the strong claim that cuts through the noise. The dominant political story about the middle class is built on a misread of what's actually happening. And the evidence is explicit. Rose and Winship show that since 1979, the share of Americans in the upper middle class rose from about 10% to 31%. That's not a rounding error, that's a structural shift. At the same time, the share of Americans who are lower middle class or poor fell substantially. Those are the author's findings, not a talking point. In other words, the ladder didn't disappear. More people climbed it, yet the rhetoric you hear, including former President Joe Biden's warning of a hollowed-out middle class, implies widespread downward mobility. Notice what's missing in that claim. There's no reconciliation with the upward movement in the data. No explanation for how a society can be getting richer in real terms while supposedly collapsing at its center. That gap between rhetoric and evidence isn't accidental. It's the tension driving everything that comes next. Because if the middle class isn't falling, then the source of frustration has to be somewhere else. Now watch how fast this escalates. If upward mobility is real, then the sense of loss many people feel can't be purely economic. And that leads to a comparison that rarely gets made. For much of the 20th century, being middle class wasn't just about income. It was about identity. It meant occupying the cultural center of the country, watching the same shows, reading the same news, sharing a sense of what normal looked like. That world doesn't exist anymore. Not because of collapse, but because of growth. As prosperity expanded, so did choice. more media, more platforms, more lifestyles, more ways to live well. Fewer institutions define a single mainstream. The mirror that once reflected a shared middle-class identity fractured. And here's the normalization moment. That fragmentation gets interpreted as decline, as if losing a single cultural center must mean the system failed. But historically, this kind of diversification follows abundance, not poverty. What feels like erosion is, in many ways, the byproduct of success. The problem is that upward mobility no longer comes with the same social affirmation it once did. And when status feels unstable, people look for someone to blame. Here's where the evidence gets sharper and more uncomfortable. The frustration people feel doesn't line up with falling incomes. It lines up with rising pressure in very specific places: housing, healthcare, higher education, three of the largest expenses in ordinary life. And they share one trait: they are among the most heavily regulated and subsidized sectors of the economy. This is where the contradiction locks in. Even as real incomes rise, these costs surge. Not because markets stopped working, but because they've been distorted. Barriers on who can build housing, on who can provide medical care, on how education is delivered, restrictions that limit supply, reduce choice, and push prices higher. Here's why that detail changes everything. The pain is real, but it isn't proof of economic decline. It's proof of policy bottlenecks. When words say growth, but lived experience says squeeze, trust collapses. And that gap becomes fertile ground for a much simpler story, one that points the finger in the wrong direction. Now the pressure starts stacking. First, incomes rise in real terms, but housing absorbs more of the gain. Then healthcare costs grow faster than wages, even as access feels more bureaucratic. Then higher education prices climb, locking families into long-term commitments before returns are clear. None of these hit in isolation, they compound. At the same time, political messaging collapses these frustrations into a single diagnosis: the system is rigged, markets failed, the middle class is dying. That explanation spreads faster than the data because it feels immediate. It gives shape to frustration without requiring precision. But here's the mini-crisis hiding in plain sight. When the source of pressure is misidentified, the response accelerates the problem. Interventions meant to restore stability start suppressing the very dynamics that allowed upward mobility in the first place. Trade restrictions, favoritism for protected industries, heavy-handed controls sold as relief. Shift the lens to yourself, because this isn't about abstract income brackets. It's about how life actually feels. You may be earning more than your parents did at your age, adjusted for inflation, yet feel less secure. Not because you're falling behind, but because the biggest decisions now carry higher stakes. Where you live, how you ensure your health, whether education is worth the cost. That mismatch creates anxiety, not poverty, but pressure. You're told you're doing better on paper, while your margin for error feels thinner. Miss one housing opportunity, face one medical shock, make one wrong education bet, and suddenly the climb feels fragile. This is why the middle class's shrinking story resonates. It translates complexity into a single emotion, unease, and it feels personal. What you're experiencing isn't individual failure. It's a system producing gains and friction at the same time. Here's the calmer, more unsettling layer beneath all of this. Systems don't fail only by collapsing. They also fail by misaligning incentives. Economic growth keeps delivering real gains, but the sectors that shape daily life are shielded from normal feedback. When supply can't respond, prices don't signal scarcity correctly. They just climb. That creates a spectacle problem. Politicians respond to visible pain, not invisible progress. It's easier to blame markets than to admit that regulation and subsidy have concentrated power, reduced competition, and hardened bottlenecks. So the narrative shifts. Abundance gets reframed as exploitation. Choice becomes chaos. Growth becomes suspect. Now we're at the fork in the road. One path treats the discomfort as evidence that growth itself is the problem. The response is to slow things down, reimpose controls, restore uniformity, promise stability by narrowing choices. It sounds comforting, but it risks turning real gains into real losses. The other path starts from a different premise, that upward movement is real, but the channels people depend on are jammed, housing constrained, healthcare insulated, education locked behind cost and credential barriers. Under this view, the next move isn't reversal but release. Here's the insight that reframes the entire story. The middle class isn't vanishing, its role is changing. When more families cross into the upper middle class, that's a success by any material measure. But success without a shared center feels like loss, and that emotional gap is where bad diagnoses thrive. The danger isn't that free markets stop delivering, it's that we confuse the costs of success with evidence of failure, and the decision sold as restoration risk sabotaging the very mobility that created those gains. This story doesn't end here. The next move is already forming, and if you want to understand it before it's misnamed again, this is where you keep watching.